I believe that, growing up black in Maine was so different from the rest of the country.
In the South, you knew what you could do and you knew what you couldn't do. Here in the North, especially Maine, you didn't know until you ran into it.
Racism in Maine is subtle, but it's definitely there.
We had the colored church up on the hill there, and of course, everybody that I knew in Portland, we all went to that church.
We don't have, per se, a black community, but church is our community.
Looking back on the years, that was where my source of strength came from Green Memorial Church.
This is the story of a small group of African Americans struggling to create and sustain a black community in northern New England, the whitest part of America. Their community centers around a church founded in the early 1800s by African Americans in Portland, Maine. Originally known as the Abyssinian Church, it later became Green Memorial AME Zion Church. Facing discrimination in their daily lives, African Americans sought refuge in the church. Through their sacrifice and love, the church has survived to this day. It continues as a spiritual home, a community center, and a leader in the struggle for racial equality in Maine. The church's story begins more than 3 centuries ago. Among Maine's early residents were several hundred slaves. Some arrived on ships from the West Indies or from the slave markets of Boston and Portsmouth. Others moved north with slave-owning families who settled in Maine. New England's economy did not depend on slave labor, but owning slaves was considered a status symbol. Ministers, judges, and other prominent citizens often purchased 1 or 2 slaves to use as farmhands or household servants. Most slaves lived in the same house as their owners. Some even ate at the same table. But slaves lived in continual fear that their families would be separated and sold at auction. In 1783, the year that the Revolutionary War ended, a court decision outlawed slavery in Massachusetts and Maine. In the decades that followed, many blacks found work in Maine's thriving maritime industry. They settled in towns along the coast. Portland, then one of the nation's busiest ports, attracted the most African Americans. On the Portland waterfront, black dock workers unloaded ships that traveled between Maine and the West Indies. Other African Americans signed on as seamen, a job that often entailed great danger. Many black women in Portland were widowed when their husbands died at sea. By 1820, the year that Maine won statehood, about 1,000 of its 300,000 residents were African Americans. In rural settlements, their presence was marked by places with such names as Nigger Ridge and Nigger Brook. African Americans in Maine were granted some rights denied them elsewhere in the North. But whites carefully drew lines to avoid mixing with blacks in intimate areas of their lives, such as school and church. These contradictions were reflected in Maine law.
In Maine, for example, they felt that the right to vote was a right that African Americans should have. On the other hand, they felt that the right to marry across races was one that should not be afforded African Americans. And so Maine was one of the 2 New England states that passed laws banning interracial marriage. There were other aspects of this inferiority. The African American population was relegated to lower paying jobs on the assumption that that was all they were suited for, that they were less intelligent, for example, and only suited for what we would consider manual labor.
Racial segregation was a way of life in the early 1800s throughout the North, even in Maine.
The segregation for blacks in Portland is very evident. In the city directories, blacks were listed in a separate section called colored at the end of the city directory. We find segregated balconies, what came to be known in the South as nigger heaven, in the theaters in Portland. Portland, unlike other northern cities, accepted the responsibility to educate blacks. They tried to do it in a way, however, that would prevent what they called the mixing of the races. So a segregated school developed in Portland around 1830, which resembled later segregated schools in the South. The African American section of the school was, of course, less well funded. Teachers were less well paid, there were fewer supplies, and fewer books available to the students. In fact, even though the 2 schoolrooms shared the same building, there were separate entrances for whites in the front and blacks around the back.
Blacks also faced segregation when traveling. The black leader, Frederick Douglass, came to Maine in the 1840s to rally support for the anti-slavery cause.
On the Eastern Railroad from Boston to Portland, there was a mean, dirty, and uncomfortable car set apart for colored travelers called the Jim Crow car. Being determined to fight the spirit of slavery wherever I might find it, I resolved to avoid this car, though it sometimes required some courage to do so.
In death as in life, blacks were kept apart from whites. African Americans in Portland were buried in separate sections of the city's eastern cemetery known as Colored Ground. John Lewis, a black minister from Concord, New Hampshire, noted the undercurrent of racism as he traveled through Maine in the summer of 1841.
It is a delightful season of the year now down east. Everything appears lovely, instead of worn-out plantations and dispirited slaves as characteristic of the South. We see delightful groves and well-regulated farms. Everything, in a word, as it ought to be, but the spirit of prejudice among the people.
Racial prejudice pervaded New England churches. It was common practice in the early 1800s to make black parishioners wait until all white church members received communion before they could come forward. At First Parish Church, Portland's oldest congregation, whites commanded every pew, except the few in the rear corners of the balcony. That is where black worshipers sat. Other Portland churches also limited seating for blacks. Discontent grew among African Americans. Finally, in 1826, 6 black residents of Portland spoke out. In an act remarkable for its day, they wrote a letter to the Eastern Argus newspaper protesting their treatment in the city's churches.
Provision for the accommodation of a very few of our people is made in several houses of public worship. The privilege granted us is associated with such circumstances as calculated to repel rather than to invite our attendance. Nay, pardon our misapprehensions if they be such. We have sometimes thought our attendance was not desired.
Throughout the North, African Americans were breaking away from white churches to form their own. Many joined black-led denominations such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the AME Zion Church. Portland's small black community decided that they too would start their own church. They formed the Abyssinian Society, naming their religious group after an ancient term for people of color. Building a church was a bold undertaking for people struggling just to make ends meet. Most members of the Abyssinian Society could afford to pledge just a few dollars. Some gave only pennies, but they pushed ahead, choosing a site amidst the black neighborhood on Munjoy Hill. Some whites came forward to help. Among them, John Neal, a Quaker writer and reformer.
Instead of sending abroad our thousands and tens of thousands of dollars to build churches within the heart of India or along the shores of Africa, what if we look about us here and see what may be done for our next-door neighbors?
The Abyssinian Church might never have been built but for the conviction and generosity of one African-American, Reuben Ruby.
He felt that the blacks should have a church of his own, and so he financed the building of it.
Reuben Ruby was ambitious, courageous, and driven. He refused to accept the limits placed on his race.
Well, Reuben Ruby was very much a self-made man. He was born in Gray in 1798. He probably had very little formal education, although we know he could read and write. He moved to Portland as a young man and got a job waiting on tables. Later, he started a hack driving business, giving coach rides around town. By the time he was 28, he had accumulated a considerable amount of property. But Ruby wasn't satisfied with that. For him, that was only a beginning.
He was a fiery person himself, and he really believed in freedom. And so, from what my grandmother and my grandfather told me, he used to go to attend all the rallies, anything to do with freedom of the slaves.
Ruby helped found the Maine Anti-Slavery Society when abolitionism was an unpopular cause. He became known as an unyielding leader in the fight for black freedom and equality. Ruby saw the Abyssinian Church as a way to further racial equality in Maine. The church opened in 1828. It quickly became the community's gathering spot. Bible classes, a sewing circle, and a colored temperance society all met there. The segregated school for Portland's black children moved into the vestry. Reverend Amos Beeman, one of the most prominent black clergymen of his day, came from Connecticut to help organize the church. It affiliated with the white-led Congregational Church. The Abyssinian Church, like other black churches throughout the North, became a hub for anti-slavery activism. When a fugitive slave from Kentucky named Lewis Clark came to Portland, no hall would allow him to speak except the Abyssinian Church. Clark gave chilling accounts of life under a brutal master. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the abolitionist writer, later drew on his experiences when creating the character of George Harris in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Abyssinian Church also joined the colored convention movement. It swept the North from 1830 to 1861. Reuben Ruby was one of the movement's leaders.
In Maine, the colored convention centered around the Abyssinian Church. At these conventions, African Americans had a chance to discuss and to express their views on what they considered were the major issues of the day that affected their community. These were issues about morality, they were issues about temperance, and they were encouragements to education. Of course, the issue that most concerned the convention was the issue of slavery and the end of slavery. Even though Portland may seem a long way from the South, many of the members of the African community there had relatives in the South, had escaped themselves from the South, and so on. So abolitionism dominated the colored convention that was there.
By the 1850s, opposition to Southern slavery had grown among white Mainers. Many were outraged by the Fugitive Slave Law, which required Northern states to return runaway slaves to their masters. Whites and blacks in Maine began working together to help slaves escape to Canada via the Underground Railroad.
There's one legendary story about a slave who stowed away on a Maine vessel that had docked in Georgia and wasn't discovered on the ship until 3 days out to sea. The owner of that ship, at great risk to himself, agreed to take the slave on to Maine and to help the slave escape from the United States. The Maine community joined together, black and white, in order to arrange for the slave's escape. Charles Pierre, a member of the Abyssinian Church, was part of a group of blacks who went on board in the dead of night to smuggle the slave off the ship, get him to shore, and whisk him away on his way to Canada.
As members of the Abyssinian Church helped free Southern slaves, they also worked steadily to build their church. By 1841, the church was able to support its first permanent minister, Reverend Amos Freeman. The church invited 6 white ministers to participate in Freeman's ordination. They were warmly welcomed by the black congregation, but Freeman was not always treated the same when visiting white churches. State Street Church in Portland was one of several white congregations that gave money each year to the Abyssinian Church. Even with that help, paying the bills was a constant struggle. Racial discrimination kept African Americans in low-paying jobs. At one point, the entire contents of the Abyssinian Church's treasury consisted of $1.65. Reverend Amos Beeman, who helped organize the Abyssinian Church, returned for a visit in 1844. He found the small congregation spiritually strengthened by their struggle.
There were the sons of the ocean, who had been tossed amid many a storm, now come to an anchor sure and steadfast in the sea of eternal love. There were the old pilgrims of the cross, who remember the days of darkness and gloom which once enshrouded that little church. The darkness of the night was gone, the clouds were chased away. The bright and morning star shone in beauty. The Son of Righteousness had arisen with healing in his wings.
Reuben Ruby, who helped the Abyssinian Church through its early struggles, left Maine in the 1840s. Ruby's adventuresome spirit led him to join the California Gold Rush of 1849. He returned to Portland with enough money from the gold fields to set himself up as a merchant. Ruby also returned to the Abyssinian Church and served as its treasurer. In his final years, he lived on Newberry Street, near the church that had been so important in his life. Reuben Ruby died at age 79. He had been a national leader in the fight for black equality and a founder of Maine's first African-American church, but his accomplishments were nearly invisible to whites. His obituary in the local newspaper referred to him merely as one of Portland's most prominent hackmen. Ruby's children grew up in the Abyssinian Church. His son, William, became a Portland firefighter, rising to the rank of district chief. More than a century later, it remains the highest position ever held by a black firefighter in Portland.
July 4th, 1866 was a very important day for Portland. It was the first Independence Day celebration after the end of the Civil War. The troops were home. It was a perfect day, very much like this one. Crowds began to gather in the streets waiting for the fireworks. William Ruby was walking along Commercial Street near Maple when he noticed smoke coming out of a boat shop near J.B. Brown's Big Sugar House. Investigating closer, he found that the building was in flames.
William Ruby reportedly was the first to raise the alarm, but firefighters could not contain the blaze. The fire raged for 17 hours, destroying City Hall, 8 churches, and every bank and lawyer's office in the city. Among the 10,000 people left homeless were many black families. On the street next to the Abyssinian Church, every building burned to the ground. Miraculously, the church survived. African Americans in Maine were even more outnumbered in 1900 than they had been a century earlier. Of the state's 700,000 residents, only 1,300 were African Americans. Besides the Abyssinian Church, Maine now had two other black churches. One served what was known as the Niggertown area of Warren. Church members worshiped in the community's schoolhouse. The other church opened in Portland in the 1890s. It was a mission of the black-led AME Zion Church. The mission grew quickly, drawing many members from the Abyssinian Church. Why they switched congregations is not clear. By joining the AME Zion mission, they were connected with black congregations throughout New England. Portland's African American community was not large enough to support two churches. As the AME Zion mission grew, the Abyssinian Church dwindled to just a few members. In 1917, the Abyssinian Church closed. Money from its sale went to help the AME Zion mission build its own church a few blocks away on Sheridan Street. By the early 1900s, race relations in Maine seemed to have improved. African Americans no longer were confined to theater balconies or segregated schools. In Portland, James Augustine Healy, the country's first black Roman Catholic bishop, completed 25 years as spiritual leader of Maine's Catholics. In Bangor, home to the state's second largest African American community, whites and blacks played together on high school sports teams.
In growing up, by being with the gang and so forth, I didn't even realize that I was colored at the time. The only thing was the color of the skin, and didn't faze them and didn't faze me a bit. And there was never any name calling among us, as we had Jewish and we had Italians and French and everything else. So there was no need of any name calling. They call you by your first name, and that's it. And that's how I grew up in life.
But racial prejudice surfaced in both subtle and obvious ways, revealing the ambivalence that many white Mainers felt toward blacks.
I can remember when we started to learn to dance, and I know in my gym class there weren't any black girls. So therefore, I didn't participate in learning to dance because somebody would always frown upon mixed dancing at that time.
The only time you ever heard about black people in the newspaper here, I mean, would be bad things. It would, if somebody did something wrong, it would always say a colored man did it or black. And if it was something good, they never mentioned the color, you know.
It was a lily white world, let's say. And that's the way they kept it.
The Ku Klux Klan gained a strong foothold in Maine in the 1920s, creating an atmosphere of intolerance. A Klan-backed candidate won election as Maine's governor in 1924. Catholics and Jews were the Klan's main targets, but African Americans were threatened as well. One black resident of Portland received a letter from the Klan warning her, "Nigger, you have till Saturday, December 9th, 1922, to pack up and go." African Americans in Maine's rural areas led particularly isolated lives. Those who had lived peacefully for generations on Malaga Island near Phippsburg literally became outcasts in 1912 when Maine's governor and executive council evicted them from the island. Many were sent to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. Elsewhere in Maine, blacks became respected members of their communities. Still, they often were treated as curiosities.
Well, I grew up in Waterville, Maine, and we only had 3 black people. It was the Osborne family. There was Eddie, the oldest, and he was the baggage master at the railroad station. And then there was the sister Marion. She was a librarian, very prim and very proper. And then there was Alice. And my first contact with the Osborne family, and they were just part of the community, was I was a little kid. And I was going with my mother to a store called Stewart's Market. And my mother said, Stanley, I'm going to have you meet Alice, and I don't want you to cry. And I didn't even know what she was talking about. And Alice came, and my mother introduced me, and she was a black lady. I had never seen a black lady before.
As African Americans struggled for acceptance in their hometowns, they also struggled to make a living. Discrimination was most striking in the work world, where African Americans found few opportunities to advance.
Most of the Negroes was employed as domestic servants, cooks, or the men would be chauffeurs or butlers.
My mother was worked for families around Portland. She would go out and cook for them, clean their houses, domestic work. In her later years, she worked for the Maine Central Railroad, which my father worked for, and she was a matron. She was in charge of the women's room.
When I was ready to graduate, we was interviewed in what school we wanted to attend. So I put on at Gorham Normal School because they was just starting vocational education at that time. And I was well-versed in vocational trade. That was my trade. And Dr. Bailey came to Portland High School and interviewed me. And he stated to me that, Harold, you could go to Gorham Normal School, but you cannot practice teaching in the state of Maine. I said, why? And he paused. He said, well, you don't realize that you're colored. They're not accepting colored student teachers or teachers at this time. He said you'd have to go south.
We knew that there weren't going to be any black policemen. There weren't going to be any black firemen. There weren't going to be any black telephone linesmen or postmen.
You could get a job running the elevator or working at somebody's home, but not in public, you know.
There was really nothing to look forward to for a black when I came out of high school in 1941.
African Americans in Maine turned to their churches for safe harbor and support. Like the Abyssinian church before it, the AME Zion Church became the anchor of Portland's black community.
When I was a teenager, I started going to Green Memorial because the minister that was there had a big family, and I met the girls, and it was just like having somebody of your own race to relate to. And when you're in a community where you're the only black, growing up and being real close with people is fine, but as you get older, they tend to drift away. And so then I started going to Christian Endeavor and Sunbeams and, you know, teen activities at church.
A long-standing tradition of church members was to hold a July 4th picnic at Sebago Lake. The picnic drew African Americans from across Maine. Also attending were black servants who traveled to Maine with wealthy families each summer to work at cottages along the coast.
The July 4th picnics were one of the biggest events of the summer season. And it looked like for weeks, everybody would ask, are you going to the picnic? Sometimes we left from the church, or we always met at Sebago Lake. And everybody would fry chicken, and there'd be all kinds of goodies, cakes and pies, and there'd be watermelons, and nobody had to go hungry. Those that weren't able to bring came anyway.
It was the big time of the year for everybody in Portland. all the colored people, I'll say.
African Americans gave generously to the AME Zion Church, but raising enough money was an ongoing challenge.
When Leonard and I went to Green Memorial Church, it was in its struggling days. There were Sundays when there were just 4 of us there.
We have had service on a Sunday with no lights. It was that bad, I mean. It was in the summertime and nobody noticed it, but we had no lights on. It'd been real difficult down through the years, but we kept it open by the grace of God.
A lot of the black people, whether they were members of the church or not, they would all come together so that we'll be able to raise funds to keep the church, because it was a community meeting place.
One of the church's most successful ways of raising money was to hold chicken dinners. They always took place on Thursdays when black domestic servants had the day off.
We really had something going for us with those dinners, because people would be backed up at noontime, clean up way out on the sidewalks, waiting to get in, you know.
They would get these chefs who were cooks on the dining car, worked for the railroad. It was their job to cut up the chicken. So they would cut it up and so forth, and then it would be put on ice, and then the women would start frying it the next day. So it was always good pan-fried chicken. And the members would take orders for delivering meals to the people that can't make it. And a lot of them would know different companies, the officials of the companies, such as the banks and so forth, and they would sell them a block of tickets and they would distribute them to their employees. And that's how that they was able to pay the mortgage off on the church, by having these chicken dinners.
One of the church's most dedicated workers was a former slave from Maryland named Moses Green. Green arrived in Portland on June 26, 1888, the day after Union Station opened. He set up a shoeshine stand in the men's room of the train station. Moses Green helped found the AME Zion Church, and it became the center of his life.
I first met him as a child by going to the Afro-Methodist Church, and which we all lived in the same neighborhood, which was the West End. And he asked my mother when I was a boy about 8 years old, would I be willing to work with him during the summertime down there in the men's room selling soap and towels. And I was a boot black for Moses Green up until 1941. Everyone knew Moses Green. He was like a landmark there. I think he was one of the first. I know he was one of the first there, and the conductors and different personnel. He knew all the presidents of the Main Central Railroad. They used to come there and have their shoe shine.
Green contributed generously to the AME Zion Church. He served as president of the trustee board and made one of the largest donations to the church's building fund.
Moses Green was a very devoted churchman. He would quote you different passages of the Bible, and you could take it from whence it came.
Many years after the death of his first wife, Green remarried at age 85. His bride, Martha, worked as a cook at a Portland hospital. A newspaper account of the wedding noted that Green's shoes had a shine to be proud of. Each Sunday morning, the Greens and their granddaughter Nota rode the bus to church. Moses Green liked to be the first to arrive. They would walk up the steep steps to the sanctuary and take their seats in the front row. He sang the old hymns in a hearty voice, though not always on key. Church members stopped by after the service to pay their respects to Brother Green.
With God beside me,
Moses Green continued shining shoes into his late 80s. He died in 1942 after working for more than 50 years at Union Station.
I know I can go on.
He was buried in an unmarked grave at Forest City Cemetery in South Portland, near others from the AME Zion Church. Moses Green, former slave and shoeshiner, left a lasting mark on Portland.
Oh, I know I can go on.
A year after Green's death, the church that he cherished was renamed Green Memorial in his honor.
They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we've struggled so long. We must be free. We must be free. We must be free.
The dawn of the civil rights movement found Maine's racial climate little changed. While there were no lynchings or whites-only signs, unspoken conventions kept African Americans separate and unequal.
I believe that none of us really recognized that, that there were two different cultures, the white culture and the black culture. We were all just kids growing up. Racism didn't enter my mind that this was a white community and a black community, and I was not included in the community of Portland, that I was an inferior individual in their eyes. I know my point of recognition was as a teenager, graduating from high school and being so close to so many of my classmates. And then actually there was like an invisible line. We went one way, the black kids went one way, and our classmates went out into the, ventured out into the world, so to speak, or the business world. And so many times I really wondered, was there something wrong with me,
Because prejudice was subtle in Maine, African Americans often reached adulthood before they realized how their life choices would be restricted by the color of their skin.
When I got out of the Army in 1958, I came back to a Portland that I wasn't expecting. I had problems finding a job, problems finding housing. I was starting a family, that kind of thing. And I couldn't take that. I couldn't take that on a personal level. I mean, I'm as good, or I thought I was as good as anybody else and could do as much as anybody else. And therefore, I started writing a letter to the editor about why this was happening and why that was happening. And I got a rude awakening because there was discrimination in housing, there was discrimination in public accommodation and employment, but nothing was being done about it.
As individuals confronted the prejudice around them, Maine's black community began to push for change. Green Memorial AME Zion Church provided a base for organizing, a place to hold meetings and the leadership of its pastors. Maine's civil rights activists focused some of their efforts on fighting segregation in the South. Blacks and whites marched through the streets of Portland and Bangor to show their support for the Mississippi Freedom Riders. Reverend John Bruce of Green Memorial Church joined 6 other activists in the August 1963 March on Washington, led by Martin Luther King Jr. The following spring, Reverend King spoke at a civil rights symposium in Biddeford, Maine. He told the crowd of 1,000 packed into a college gym, while you cannot change the heart of man through legislation, you can change his habits. civil rights activists set out to change the habits of white Mainers. Racism in northern New England was less obvious than in the South, but just as deeply ingrained.
When the rest of the country began to recognize the racism in America, and we recognized all of a sudden it's here in Portland, Maine, too. When you try to get an apartment next to your mother and you can't get it, maybe it is racism. Or when when the fact comes that you couldn't get the jobs that you wanted, it must be racism.
Maine's civil rights movement was led by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, chapters organized in Bangor, Lewiston, Brunswick, and Portland. Several ministers and members of Green Memorial Church played key roles in the NAACP. The civil rights group also attracted many white members.
This is a white state. We represent as blacks less than 1% of the population. Now, out of that, there are a few blacks that are going to be involved and are going to make a stand. So we have to rely on the white community.
As sit-ins and civil disobedience took place elsewhere in the country, Maine activists lobbied for laws banning discrimination.
Some of the real big issues that we had in Maine at that time, at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, was housing, employment, public accommodations, and a perception that the blacks didn't live in Maine, and those that lived in Maine didn't ask for much, didn't need much, didn't want much, and that kind of thing.
Many African Americans were forced to live in substandard apartments due to discrimination.
I had heard people say that finding a rent was hard, but we lived in our own home all our lives, and then in the early 60s we had a fire, and because I had a big family, and we had to find a place to live while our house was being repaired, and I was really shocked when I went to friends and people that I had known all my life, you know, to get a rent, and they'd say, well, we don't rent to coloreds, or that we don't know how our other tenants would feel, and we wouldn't want to lose them. I had been in an ACP before then, but after that, I really got to working, you know, towards racial harmony, and all those things had never really affected me until that time, and then it really hit home.
The Maine NAACP pushed for a bill that would forbid landlords from turning people away because of their race, religion, or national origin. But the Fair Housing Bill was opposed by powerful interests.
Most of our opposition came from realtors who took out ads in the paper, who took out ads over TV against such a thing, because you have to remember, in 1964, 1965, this was all new. Maine is a white state, which has always done what it wanted to do, and black people, for the most part, don't exist here. So there was a big opposition to that from the realtors.
In 1963, legislators voted down the Fair Housing Bill. 2 years later, the legislature finally passed the measure. It was one of the greatest victories in Maine's civil rights movement. Activists also targeted job discrimination. New federal laws required businesses to integrate their workforces. Maine companies that had hired only whites for sales clerks, telephone operators, and other jobs now were told they must hire minorities. Maine's NAACP worked to ensure that employers obeyed the new law.
We approached the Central Maine Power as well as the New England Tell and Tell. We told them that we had qualified people, and as you know, that you had to hire so many minorities, and the barrier seemed to come down, but it was actually forced on them that these are the things that they had to do.
Another contentious civil rights battle in Maine involved the Elks Club, a fraternal order that restricted its membership nationwide to whites. In 1971, students at Portland's Deering High School decided to hold their senior prom at the Elks Club over the objections of the NAACP. Una Richardson was one of 3 black students in the senior class.
I had a meeting in front of the whole student body and announced it that and pled with them that maybe they should change the location of the senior prom and not hold the Deering Senior Prom at the Elks Club, and maybe if the Eastland wasn't a better choice. They didn't think that they wanted to change the location and stated that they wanted to have it at the Elks Club because the Elks Club was air conditioned, and it was a fairly new building at the time, and it was the only one that was air conditioned. And they weren't concerned with racial issues involving it, and I pretty much was.
Deering's senior class went ahead with its prom plans. Una Richardson did not attend. Instead, she and some of her classmates joined the NAACP picketing outside the dance. The civil rights movement centered around Green Memorial Church. After meeting for many years at a white church, the Portland NAACP moved to Green Memorial in the early 1970s.
I believe the move was more of a symbolic move, that was the black church here in Portland, Maine, and that it should be involved.
Green Memorial Church supported the African American community in other ways. It was a spiritual center and a place where blacks could socialize with each other. Many members viewed the church as their extended family.
I grew up in a school system where most of the time there were only 2 or 3 blacks in that particular school that I was in. It meant a great deal to me as a child growing up, being able to go to the church and have relationships with other black children.
Our church is the main black church in Maine, and most of my lifetime it has been the only one. And all the information, like job things and happenings in families, births and deaths, and any information, they tell you that, in the church bulletin, and it keeps you abreast of what's happening in your world.
And I can say this in all sincereness, that was where I really, really got my reservoir of spiritual strength, that's when I was my strongest spiritually, when I did go to Green Memorial Church.
Green Memorial Church remains one of the few predominantly black institutions in an overwhelmingly white state. In 1990, African Americans made up less than 0.5% of Maine's population. Much progress has been made in ending blatant forms of discrimination. African Americans no longer are restricted to living in certain neighborhoods or to working at menial jobs.
We have men, women working as clerks in the banks that we didn't have before. We have them working in stores that we didn't have before. We've had blacks who have been on the police department that haven't been before. We see blacks in roles that they are qualified and can do now. Whereas before, we didn't see blacks at all. We were invisible.
Today, despite the triumphs of the civil rights movement, African Americans still face wariness and prejudice.
While I was at work just the other day, I work in a fast food restaurant, and I remember walking through the restaurant, and all of a sudden, there was this little boy that was sitting in his chair eating his food, and he just jumped up and started pointing at me and saying, "Look at him, look at him." And I knew, of course, that the reason why he was doing that was because I was black, and this little boy hadn't had much experience dealing with black people.
Incident happened to me one day was when I was in a store, myself and my 2 daughters. I was followed around as though I was going to steal something. And as I walked from one part of the store to the next, just observing, I noticed that I was the only one being followed. And the reason for that was that I was the only, myself, my children was the only blacks that was in this store. And I call it a subdued racism, where nothing much is said, nothing much is done, but you can sort of tell by the way you're looked upon.
Hate crimes is on the upswing in the state of Maine, as it is across the country. A Central Maine Power Company employee was harassed by the police department in Scarborough because they thought he was somebody else that had committed a crime. A young black school kid was shot at by a crossing guide because his girlfriend was white. So the problem still exists here.
Racism is alive and well in Maine, let me tell you. It's an ongoing thing. Every single day we get calls from, at the NACP from all over the state about schools and businesses and job places. It's really terrible. And it's so sad, like in small towns where there's white people and they've never seen black people, they have that built-in hatred the minute they see them. I mean, you can just feel it.
The old Abyssinian church that preceded Green Memorial still stands in Portland. It serves as a reminder of the time when churches and schools were segregated in Maine. The neglect of this historic building also shows how little importance has been placed on the experience of African Americans in northern New England. After the church closed in 1917, it served as an apartment house, stable, and junk shop. In 1991, it was boarded up and abandoned. Few know of the church's proud past. A few blocks up Munjoy Hill, Green Memorial Church remains a sure and steadfast anchor for Maine's African American community. In recent years, many interracial families have joined Green Memorial, the congregation that began as a refuge for African Americans spurned by white churches, now has come full circle to welcome white members.
I feel that Green Memorial just may be the church where God has ordained to accept, especially interracial marriages, people who come from a background that's not accepted in the normal, per se, church. I see this happening at Green Memorial from the inception of my pastorate here, and I feel that this just may become one of those churches.
The church still relies on chicken suppers to help pay its bills, as it did 50 years ago in Moses Green's lifetime. Dinners are always on Thursdays, a tradition carried on from the time when many church members worked as domestics. Green Memorial continues to struggle financially. During the past year, the church's phone was disconnected. Rain poured through holes in the roof, but those who know Green Memorial best say it will endure.
The struggles, financially, we're having a real hard time now because of the smallness of the group, but we'll survive. We've come through harder times than this.
Little is much when you place it in the hands of God. And this is how I feel about Green Memorial. We have a small congregation, steady growing. We have people who come from all walks of life, but mostly from the meager walk of life, living from paycheck to paycheck, working, struggling. And I believe this is that type of church.
Have you any rivers that to you seem uncrossable?
Green Memorial Church really was the beginning of my personal spiritual journey.
The church has given me strength throughout my life.
Specialize seem impossible.
It's uplifting, and it's like my other family, and everybody meets there.
And have you any rivers? Oh, and have you any mountains?
Green Memorial, I believe it's always going to survive. It's the symbol. It's the black symbol.
There's a purpose for this church here. God has a purpose for this church. Always has been and always will be.
Things that seems impossible, and he can do what no other one can do. My mother prayed for me, had me on her mind. She took the time and prayed for me. I'm so glad she prayed. I'm so glad she prayed. I'm so glad she prayed for me. Somebody sang for me. Had me on their mind. They took the time and sang